So there are a couple of quotations there that I always put up to remind myself that these issues are potentially of great policy relevance. Policymakers really do seem to understand the idea that expectations play a vital role in the behavior of the economy and that we need good models of them. So I'm going to start off the first half of the talk, or first part of the talk will be just kind of an outline of adaptive learning, starting from scratch, so quickly move through the basics of it. And then I'm going to consider through most of the talk a couple of methodological issues that I think are really important in adaptive learning, which are the planning horizon of the agents and the degree of structural information that they have. And something that I think both of these issues are beginning to play a big role in adaptive learning. And I'll run through some examples of that as well as the different approaches. So the setting is that macroeconomic models, of course, are based on optimizing agents, typically in dynamic stochastic settings, and can be summarized by a dynamic system in which a vector of endogenous variables, aggregates, let's say, depend on their past values, which incorporates the both endogenous states, and also expectations of their future values, which might be one step ahead in the first equation there, as well as exogenous variables, exogenous observables and unobservables, which I've labeled WT there. So much of the setting, one step ahead is good enough. Many settings in macro, one step ahead is good enough. But in others settings, sometimes you want to think about the determination of the vector of endogenous variables depending on the whole sequence of future expectations. So we'll see examples of that as we go through. Clearly, the presence of expectations there makes economics, macroeconomics especially, very different from natural sciences. There isn't a counterpart of expectations in most of natural sciences. So the question of how expectations are formed is clearly quite crucial to economics generally and macroeconomics in particular. And of course, since the 1970s, the rational expectations hypothesis has been the paradigm, and in a sense, it's still the natural benchmark. But of course, I'm sure we all agree, rational expectations assumes a lot of knowledge and a lot of coordination on the part of agents, and we really need, it's not, in most settings, it's not a realistic model. Rational expectations assumes a lot of knowledge, and it assumes coordination implicitly, and it begs a question of, well, what kind of rationality, what kind of model of rationality would deliver rational expectations, or would it deliver something else? One's viewpoint, our viewpoints here vary depending on whether we think rational expectations is sometimes a reasonable hypothesis, and some people like Mordecai who have asserted that it's never a reasonable hypothesis. So how could it be a reasonable hypothesis? Well, I like to appeal to the cognitive consistency principle, which is I think we want to model agents in our economic models as about as smart as a good economist, about as smart as we are. I don't like the idea that they're a lot smarter than we are. I don't like the idea that they're a lot stupider than we are. I like them about as smart as we are. Okay, so we vary. And we also vary in whether we're theorists or whether we're econometricians. And I think those are the two broad branches of the cognitive consistency principle. The modeling agents like theorists takes us along the adductive line, which Roger will be talking about later this morning. I'm going to focus on the modeling agents as econometricians. That's the adaptive line or evolutive line, this morning. So in the adaptive line, agents select models. They estimate parameters. They update these models and the parameters over time. They use them to forecast, and they make decisions based on those forecasts. So here's the simplest example, the one that really kicked off this literature. It's the Muth-Cobweb model, which Florian already yesterday, the first talk, referred to. Price, let's say, depends on the expectations of price formed at the end of the preceding period, last period, of today's current price, as well as on a vector of exogenous observables, WT minus 1, and a white noise shock. We can assume that, the model is linear. This could arise, for example, from demand and supply. That's the Muth-Cobweb model. There's a downward sloping demand curve, or it's usually downward sloping. There's a supply curve in which the farmers, the preceding period, time t minus 1, make a forecast of the price, decide how much to plant, and that together with random factors determines supply, and then at time t, supply and demand clear, and you get the reduced form, which I've labeled RF there, hopefully, in which price depends on expected price and on this vector of shocks. You could also, I've called this the Muth-Lucas type model because a very simplified version and linearized version of the Lucas model, which Lucas monetary model, comes to the same thing. Suppose output QT depends on unexpected price change, PT minus the expectation of PT at time t minus 1, and on white noise shock, and then you complete it with an aggregate demand curve, which here is a simple quantity theory. Money plus velocity of money is equal to price plus quantity, everything's in logs. You get exactly the same reduced form. The Muth model, if demand curves slope downward, supply curves slope upward, you get negative feedback. Lucas model, you get positive feedback. And in the Lucas model, the parameter alpha is less than 1. So under rational expectations, this is a particularly convenient model because there's a unique rational expectations equilibrium. It's easy to solve. P is a linear function of WT minus 1 and the white noise shock. The coefficient vectors are pinned down. There they are. Okay, so then you can ask, well, how would agents coordinate on this using the adaptive learning approach? And the standard, the answer from the least squares learning literature is, let agents have a forecasting model. Let's give them the model in which price is simply a linear function of the observables at time t minus 1 and the white noise shock. They estimate the relationship between P, T, and WT minus 1 using a least squares regression. And they update those parameters over time. So at any given instant in time, based on past data, they have parameter estimates AT minus 1 and BT minus 1. Using those, they make a forecast. So, start the period with some initial estimates. AT minus 1, BT minus 1. There's a draw of WT minus 1. That's the exogenous variable. They make their forecasts. And then, given those forecasts and the white noise shock, the actual price is realized. That's the temporary equilibrium at time t. Now the agents have another data point. They update their data points. They make a new forecast for the following period with the revised estimates and the new WT, and you keep going. And the problem originally posed by Margaret Bray and Jean Sabin was, will this converge to rational expectations? So typically we write this as a dynamic stochastic recursive system. There's, in this particular case, how you write it out as a recursive system. Expectations depend on the parameter vector. I'm now calling the whole thing phi. And on the vector zt minus 1, which is wt minus 1 augmented by the intercept, there's the equation for prices. And then the phi t and rt is least squares written in a recursive way. Phi is the parameter vector of interest that we're updating. Rt is an estimate of the second moment matrix, which is also updated recursively, and this is just a recursive version of least squares. The question is whether AT, BT converges to A bar, B bar as time goes to infinity, and Bray and Sabin, together with Marcet and Sargent, a few years later, completing the picture, gave us the following result, which is that there's convergence almost surely if that feedback parameter alpha is less than 1, and convergence with probability 0 if it's greater than 1. So that's the starting point of this, the adaptive learning literature. And the condition is obviously satisfied, both for the Muth model, provided demand curves are downward sloping and supply curves are upward sloping, and the Lucas model, in which the feedback parameter is positive but it's less than 1. So in those cases, I think you could interpret this as a defense of rational expectations. But it's an asymptotic defense. It may take a long time. Speed of convergence is an issue. All kinds of other things are an issue. But anyway, that's the benchmark result. Now, the proof of this, Bray and Sabin used a Martingale convergence theorem. Marset and Sargent used stochastic approximation techniques, which ultimately have the Martingale convergence theorem at their heart. But anyway, it's a proof that's not it's not exactly straightforward. And on the other hand, it's easy to get the stability condition alpha less than 1 using the E-stability principle, which is based on associating a differential equation with the stochastic recursive system that I just showed you. And then it turns out that that principle is applicable in the E-stability tool is applicable in a wide range of models. So let me summarize that. So in the case of the problem at hand, the cobweb model, here's how you do E-stability. You say, suppose P is a linear function of intercept in WT minus 1 with parameters A and B, where A and B are not necessarily the rational expectation values A bar, B bar. Just posit that they're that. And let's hold A and B fixed temporarily. Then the relevant forecast is, of course, A plus B prime WT minus 1. You can insert that into the reduced form. That's the expectation that you insert in, and then you can solve that for PT as a function of the intercept in WT minus 1 and the white noise shock. And you get different parameters unless you have the rational expectations parameter. That gives you a map from the perceived law of motion parameters AB to the actual law of motion parameters T of AB. And you can see alpha playing a crucial role there. Then the E-stability principle is set up this artificial differential equation in notional time tau in which A and B are adjusted, so d by d tau of AB, the vector AB, is equal to T of AB minus AB. And if that differential equation system is stable, here it's linear, so I can just say it's stable, but if it was a nonlinear system, I'd say locally stable if I wanted local stability results. If it's stable, then least squares learning will converge. In some, you have to be more careful in general about what do you mean by, is it convergence with probability 1 or with high probability or with probability 1 if you could strain estimates in some compact set. But anyway, the E-stability principle is that in some sense, least squares learning is stable if E-stability holds and otherwise not. And from the differential equation, it's just immediates. In this case, it's linear. You can immediately see that the condition, of course, is that the differential equation have eigenvalues with negative real parts. That's the same thing here as alpha less than 1. Okay, so I set it up there in the cobweb model. It's really works quite generally. I call it a principle rather than when you're at the general level, because of course whether you can prove it or not depends on the setting. It's got a lot of support numerically in cases where you can't prove it. There are a lot of circumstances where you can prove it, that it actually governs stability under least squares learning. But the basic technique is simply that you think of a rational expectations equilibrium, and you can apply it in situations where there's multiple rational expectations equilibrium. You think of a rational expectations equilibrium, you represent that as a stochastic process or a law of motion with specific parameters under rational expectations. Then you withdraw the information about those parameters, and you think of the mean up and then you obtain the actual law of motion that would be generated by that perceived law of motion with parameters that are different from the rational expectations equilibrium. And that gives you a map. So you have these parameter vectors phi, and you have a map to T of phi, the actual law of motion parameters governed, generated by those, that forecasting rule given the vector phi. So these rational expectations equilibria can take lots of forms. It could be an ARMA process. It could be the parameters of an ARMA process. It could be the parameters of a vector autoregression. It could be a nonlinear model. It could be the values of a 7 cycle. It could be a sunspot equilibrium with particular sunspots, and then it would be the parameters on the sunspot solution. It's pretty general. And so in general, you get this map. You've got a fixed point phi bar that corresponds to rational expectations equilibrium. You look at the E-stability differential equation. Typically, it's nonlinear. You linearize it. You look at the Jacobian of dt minus I, or equivalently, just look at the Jacobian matrix of dt. And the rule is if all the eigenvalues of the Jacobian matrix dt have real parts less than 1, then it's locally stable under learning, and if not, not. So it's a technique that could be used in and has been used in multivariate linearized models. So that means that you can use it in RBC models, you can use it in overlapping generations models, New Keynesian models, DSGE models, just about anything. And then just as a very brief aside, this came up before, it may come up later today. If you're thinking in terms of inductive learning, then iterations of this T-map also play a role in the inductive stability conditions. I won't go beyond saying it plays a role. Whereas here we do this in a continuous sense, a differential equation sense. Okay, before I leave the kind of this introductory part, let me mention one modification that's become very prominent in the adaptive learning literature, which is so-called constant gain learning dynamics. If we go back to this recursive setup for the Muth-Lucas model, you'll see that in the updating equation for phi t, there's a t inverse in front of RT inverse. And again, in the RT equation, there's a t inverse. So that reflects the fact that under adaptive learning, the sample size is growing. And so the weight that is put on each new data point should go down at rate 1 over t. Actually, on the right-hand side of the phi t equation there, you see the last period's forecast error. So recursive least squares takes the last forecast error, twists it according to the second moment matrix and the regressor, and then throws a weight of t inverse on it, and that's what's used to update phi t minus 1 to phi t. So you don't have to use t inverse for this. So that's called the gain in the literature and the engineering literature from which this is drawn. It's called the gain. Under constant gain learning, you replace t inverse by a small constant, or a constant anyway. The constant would be less than 1. Often it's small, like 4%, 3%, whatever. Depends on the setting. And you can think of that as a discount of least squares. So you're putting more weight on recent data than on past data. It's constant in the sense that every new data point gets a constant weight, but that corresponds to a geometric declining weight on all the previous data. So why would agents do that? First of all, as I said, there's an engineering literature that lies behind this, a statistical engineering literature. And the argument given there is equally applicable in economics, which is that agents, so remember here we're modeling what agents in our model do, but we're thinking of agents in our model as kind of like us. So why do other people use constant gain learning? They're worried about the possibility of structural change of an unknown form. If we knew the form of the structural change, then of course you might model that directly. But suppose you're worried about structural change, you're not quite sure what form it's going to take. Well, then there's an advantage to putting more weight on recent data because it's more relevant than older data. Presumably the choice of the gain would actually reflect how much structural change you think there is, or might be, or how robust you want your estimation to be against this structural change. But anyway, that's the justification. So now you can ask the question, well, how does that affect the asymptotic properties of recursive least squares? So now we're doing discounted recursive least squares, or constant gain recursive least squares, or it's also been called perpetual learning. Well, in the case of the Muth model, we can say, what if the agents are worried about structural change, but actually there's no structural change? They're just worried about it. What does that do? What it does is you then get convergence of AT, BT, but not to A bar, B bar, but to a stochastic process that's in a neighborhood of AT, BT. And you can describe that more precisely. But intuitively, the variance of AT, BT around A bar, B bar, or the dispersion around it, is governed by the gain parameter. The smaller the gain parameter, the more tight it is around A bar, B bar, and in the decreasing gain, it actually converges, probability 1 to A bar, B bar. So you can do that in the Muth-Lucas model, just as a very quick illustration. Suppose you had the Kagan model. So remember the Muth-Lucas model, PT depended on the expectation at time t minus 1 of PT. What I call the Kagan model, because it originally appeared, I guess, in Kagan's Supply and Demand for Money and Inflation, Hyperinflation paper, I think it was. PT depends on the the future forecast of P. So PT depends on the expectation at time t of PT plus 1. And you get exactly the same equation from a lot of kind of standard ad hoc macro models. This applies to, well, it's the Lucas asset pricing model with risk neutrality. You can turn it around and get PT is equal to beta inverse. I'm sorry, beta, I mean the discount factor times ET PT plus 1. So again, positive and less than 1, but close to 1. You can get it in an overlapping generations model once you've linearized it. Then you can have alpha any value. It could be less than -1, negative, positive. Anyway, interpret it as or it could be an exchange rate model, simple purchasing power parity exchange rate model. There are lots of illustrations of the Kagan model, so I should be pointing here rather than here because you can't. Okay, anyway, if you have, so again, there is a rational expectations equilibrium in which P is a linear function of W. In this model, there can be multiple equilibria, which include explosive bubbles if alpha is between 0 and 1, say. But anyway, there's a solution in which PT linearly depends on WT. If, say, you have to model the WT process, but suppose it's AR1, it'll just be a linear function of WT. And suppose the estimates are estimated using straight least squares, then you converge to the rational expectation solution. It would be like a fundamental solution in the asset pricing setup. Or suppose you had constant gain learning, well, then you get additional, then the coefficients kind of precess around the rational expectations values, and you can get excess volatility, correlated excess returns, and so on. So a really simple change in the learning rule can get a lot of interesting results very simply and quickly. Okay, so then a few more general comments on learning theory, and then I'll turn to those methodological issues that I said I was going to. So the general implications of adaptive learning theory are that, well, first, it can be used to assess the plausibility of actually getting to a rational expectations equilibrium. Some rational expectations equilibrium are stable under learning, others are not. And sometimes you have models with multiple equilibria, and then it can be used as a selection criterion. You pick solutions that are stable or locally stable under learning and shun those that are not locally stable under learning. Or you can modify these squares and you get persistent learning dynamics. So you can get new dynamics that are not rational expectations equilibria, and that can be true even in cases where there's a unique rational expectations solution, and you've modified the rules so that you don't have complete convergence to the rational expectation solution. There are other reasons why you can get persistence learning dynamics I'll mention in a minute. And then, of course, there are policy implications. Very often, one of the equations in your model is a policy equation, and it may be that depending on the way monetary policy is set, the equilibrium of interest is stable under learning, or it may not be stable under learning. So, or it might turn out to govern the speed of convergence. So it could very well be that adaptive learning helps you out on how to set policy to facilitate the coordination of expectations on the equilibrium of interest. Okay, so there have been a bunch of methodological issues that have arisen over the last decade or two. They include things like this. Okay, you're modeling agents as econometricians in this particular version of the cognitive consistency principle. So if they're econometricians, they presumably face the real-world problems that econometricians face, like what exactly is the correct specification? Most econometric textbooks have sections on omitted variables, misspecified models, included irrelevant variables, you know, usual stuff. Can you deal with that here? Yes, of course. You can give agents a misspecified model. It can have omitted variables. They can do all their updating and so on. And there's analog of rational expectations equilibrium is the restricted perceptions equilibrium, in which agents are using the best model they can within the class that they allow themselves, like not including a particular variable. And then there's an extension of the E-stability principle that works in that setup as well. The other issues are things like discounted least squares and structural change. I've already mentioned that, so I won't say more right now. Heterogeneous expectations. Well, obviously, yesterday that was the key point, was heterogeneous expectations. There's no doubt you look at the world, you see heterogeneous expectations. It's a big issue. Everything that I said up to now did not require heterogeneous expectations, or assumed homogeneous expectations. But you can adapt adaptive learning to allow, in various ways, for heterogeneous expectations. You could have heterogeneity of priors, for example. And in fact, in the original Muth model analyzed by Margaret Bray and Jean Sabin, they had heterogeneous priors. They all converged eventually to rational expectations. But maybe you have constant gain learning versions of this, and they don't all quite converge, and you have heterogeneity in the limit. You can have different agents using different perceived laws of motion. You can do that. You can have different learning rules. You can have some using decreasing gain learning, some using constant gain learning, or some using least squares learning, and some using some version of stochastic gradient learning. You could have them using different forecast models. Some agents use one forecast model, other agents use another forecast model. So there's a lot of potential there, and some of these issues have been examined. Multiple forecasting models seems particularly important, and that's the kind of line that was, I think, that Kars Homes and Buzz Brock really have pursued in a lot of contexts, and Florian again referred to that yesterday and gave some examples of that. So that's a model in which there are several different forecasting models on the table, and each period the proportion of agents using one forecast model versus another depends on their recent forecasting performance, or some measure of fitness. Of course, if you have multiple models on the table, you don't have to say, well, some people use one and other people use another. It could be that we all use both of them or all of them. So you can also think about Bayesian model averaging. So that's another way that the adaptive learning literature can go, has gone a bit. There are some examples there. We can also talk about the degree of rationality of agents. That'll come back, but even in the dynamic predictor selection model as set up by Brock and Homes, they actually had some models which were more expensive to use than others. That would be an illustration of that. Okay, and then we come to the two issues that I want to focus on for the remainder of the talk, which is the planning horizon and the extent of structural knowledge. So the point is that very often we have models in which agents live forever. They probably shouldn't live forever, but they should live a long time. And that doesn't appear in the Muth model. It doesn't appear in the Kagan model. So what do we do about that? And a variety of approaches have been followed, and I'll talk about those. And then another issue, which I guess is logically separate, but turns out to be also connected. In fact, all of these issues are connected in some sense, is how much structural knowledge do the agents have? And the point here is that the forecasting rules that I've been giving you, the least squares learning, it's very unstructural, right? Least squares is wonderful this way. Least squares gives you, in a stationary world, the projection of the variable that you're trying to forecast on your information set, and it has some optimality properties. But it doesn't use any structure at all. But on the other, anyway, we'll come to this. Okay, so on the planning horizon, so as I was saying, the Lucas-Muth model, prices are one step ahead. If you have the Kagan model or the overlapping generations model with two-period lives, then price depends on expected price next period, and on this vector of exogenous observables. But in the RBC model, or the new Keynesian model, agents live forever. So I've described two main approaches to deal with this. One is what I've called Euler equation learning, or has been called Euler equation learning, or I'll generalize this, and it'll be called shadow price learning, and the other sometimes called infinite horizon learning. And I'll talk about each of these and what their advantages and disadvantages are. And there are other possibilities too. So the the generalization of Euler equation learning that I'm going to present is based on work with Bruce McGue, and we call it shadow price learning, and it's really a bounded optimality approach. It's bounded optimality in the sense that agents are only maximizing in a fully optimal way asymptotically. So let's set this up in terms of or we set it up in this paper in terms of a linear quadratic setting. It doesn't have to be done that way, but we can get formal results this way. So there's a state variable x, there's a state vector x, there's a vector of controls u here. The agents are maximizing expected discounted, let's just call it utility. And utility is quadratic in the state and in the controls. And it's subject to a transition equation which is linear. So it's a standard linear quadratic problem. So xt plus 1 depends in a linear way on lag states xt, on the vector of controls ut, and on a white noise vector of shocks epsilon t plus 1. So, and a simple example are various versions of Robinson Crusoe models. I'll give you an example in a minute. But just think of this as a single agent maximization problem. It can be embedded into a general equilibrium setting, but think of this as a single agent maximization problem. So under well-known conditions, this linear quadratic model can be solved for the sequence of controls that maximize the criterion to deliver the optimal solution. And it's a linear feedback rule. ut depends on a matrix F as a function of the state, where F is as given. Here the matrices Q, R, and W are the preference parameters, which we'll assume known. And matrices A and B govern the transition of the state. And so there's this relatively simple, I suppose, or complex, depending on how you think of your agents, how much matrix algebra they know, relating F to those structural parameters. Oh, and P. And what is P? Well, P comes from analyzing the Bellman's equation and gives the Riccati equation that's listed there, which typically does not have a closed form solution. But you can solve it numerically. And I guess this is straightforward if your agents have access to Mathematica and or something, and they are pretty good at this sort of thing. Anyway, clearly, actually solving this requires a sophisticated agents with pretty good computational skills. So the shadow price learning approach that I'm about to describe replaces rational expectations and full optimality with adaptive learning, with bounded optimality, and it's going to be based on the Lagrangian approach. So it's a lot of equations, but it's pretty straightforward to describe. You set up the Lagrangian and you write down the first order conditions. The first order conditions there are the ut equation and the lambda t equation. And lambda, the Lagrange multipliers, that's a vector of the shadow prices. It's the value to the agents of an extra unit of each of the state variables. So under rational expectations, those first order equations, together with the transition equation and the transversality condition, identify optimal decision making. But we want our agents to be boundedly optimal and boundedly rational, so we have them do the following instead. They replace A and B, that's the matrices that govern the transition equation, with estimates, AT, BT. And they're going to update those by recursive least squares. So that's just running regressions over and over of state on lag state controls. Now, they don't know the shadow prices. So we have to have them, we replace the shadow prices, lambda t, and their forecast of the shadow prices, ET lambda t plus 1, which you see up there, with estimates. So we'll call those E hat T lambda T star and E hat T lambda T plus 1 star. So the first order conditions at the top are replaced by the equations at the bottom, in which UT depends on, so the vector of controls depends on the state xt which they observe, with a matrix that is based on their utility functions, so we assume they know their preferences, and on the expected shadow price next period, their forecast of the shadow price vector next period, which depends on their preferences, and also on their estimate of BT, which is one of the matrices in the transition equation. So given forecasts of the shadow prices, they know how to choose their controls. This is our model of how they're going to learn and optimize over time. They have an estimate of shadow prices, they know the state, they have these estimates of parameters, they choose their controls. We can also use the second equation to have them update their estimates of the shadow prices in the current period. So given their forecasts of the shadow prices next period, given the state, given the controls, given the other matrices that they either know or estimate, they can update their estimates of lambda. How do they forecast, though? How do they, I started by forecasting the shadow prices. How do they do that? We go to the second bit there. Under the optimal solution, lambda is just a linear function of the state. Okay, well, they've got estimates of their shadow prices, lambda t, and they have observations of the state, so they can just run regressions. They can estimate this relationship which is present under the fully optimal solution. So they estimate H. They have each period, they get a new estimate of their shadow prices, they have a new observation of the state, and they add that, they run a regression of lambda on H. And then to forecast lambda next period, they have their estimate of H, they have their estimate of the transition equations, and they combine those into the equation there at the bottom. That's their estimate of the shadow prices next period. So they can again get new controls for this period. They can update their estimate of the shadow prices period, and we just let it roll. And the question is, do they learn to optimize? And the answer is, they do. It's a stochastic recursive system. It's broader than least squares learning in the sense that they're now estimating shadow prices, which they don't actually observe. They have to estimate those too. But remarkably, really, the shadow price learning converges. So it's this typical sort of learning result, which is that under standard assumptions for the linear quadratic problem, and assuming a suitable projection facility, which I haven't described in detail, but it'll be familiar to learning people, then under the shadow price learning scheme that I've outlined, you get convergence to the fully optimal solution almost surely. So we think this is a striking result because decisions converge asymptotically to the fully rational and fully optimal solution, but it's a relatively simple problem for the agents. Instead of having an infinite horizon problem, we've converted it to a two-period optimization problem using these shadow prices. Okay, and then, I have to say one more thing about this. So there's an example, here's an example of a Robinson Crusoe problem. We've made it a little bit more complicated than would be typical. We have, we have quadratic utility and consumption. We have, let's see, ST is the number of trees, so it's a Robinson Crusoe problem with trees, but output depends on trees that you planted the previous period and also the period before that. So there are young trees and old trees. Young trees have to be weeded, and that takes effort. That's the phi st minus 1 squared bit in the utility function. But apart from that, it's pretty standard. And so at the bottom, you see that the vector, the control here, which is just how much you consume, depends on the forecast of the shadow price of young trees. There's a shadow price for young trees and old trees. You update in the ways that I describe. I don't want to go into the details, but I want to make one other point, which is this. As I've set it up, everything's done in terms of shadow prices and in terms of estimation of the state equation and estimation of how shadow prices depend on states. But in some cases, just like in the usual dynamic programming setup, you can substitute out shadow prices and get an equation, an Euler equation, which summarizes the first order condition. Sometimes you can do that here too. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Here's a case in which you can get an Euler equation out of it by substituting out the Lagrange multipliers, and then you get what we would call Euler equation learning, which is now viewed as a special case of shadow price learning, in which, so the key equation there is in the middle, CT and ST, the number of young trees, consumption and the number of young trees that you're deciding to take over to the next period today, depends on parameter estimates and on your forecast of your own consumption in the next 2 periods, which sounds strange that you're forecasting your own consumption, but makes perfect sense if you then give yourself a law of motion for consumption in which you say, well, I think the amount I consume is going to depend on the state, which is the number of young trees and the number of old trees, and you estimate and those coefficients and update them over time. It comes to the same thing, almost. It's not quite the same thing. It's closely related to shadow price learning. It imposes some extra restrictions. Sometimes it's identical to shadow price learning. Sometimes there's not an Euler equation and you have to do shadow price learning. But it's all of the same family. My point is Euler equation learning, which has been used quite a lot, can be thought of as a special case of shadow price learning. Okay, so let me go on to the other approach. Okay, infinite horizon learning. So an alternative to bounded optimality in shadow price learning is to fully solve, to really optimize, given your forecast for the future over the infinite future. There's some antecedents to this, but really this approach has been forcefully pressed by Bruce Preston, who's here obviously, and Stefano Giuseppe, and they have a number of really nice papers. One in the Bruce Preston has one in the International Journal of Central Banking and the Journal of Monetary Economics, and then he and Stefano have a paper in AEJ Macro and for new Keynesian models, and won the American Economic Review recently for the RBC model. So a bunch of papers in which this has been very carefully explored. The basic idea of infinite horizon learning is that agents make fully optimal decisions conditional on their forecast of the path of all of the variables that are outside their control over the infinite future. Okay, so an advantage of infinite horizon learning, I'll call it, IH learning, which kind of matches the Bruce Preston setup, I think, in terms of the way it's developed, is that the terminology matches. Agents are fully optimal given their forecasts. They impose explicitly transversality conditions, intertemporal budget constraints. It's all there. And you can make it very explicit as well. You can get explicit equations in terms of forecasts. So let me illustrate this in the Ramsey model. So agents here are, so this will be a non-stochastic Ramsey model, which will make it easier for me to sail through these points. Suppose that agents maximize expected discounted utility subject to their asset evolution constraint. There's a rate of return on assets R, little r, that's the gross rate of return. They also have a unit of labor for which they receive a wage. There may be government spending and taxes. I guess as I've set it up, as I'm going to describe it right here, there's no debt. Government spending is balanced exactly by taxes. It will have constant government spending. That'll keep things cleaner. So it's a standard maximization problem, infinite horizon maximization problem. And again, there's an Euler equation, of course, which is given there at the top, relating consumption this period to expected consumption next period, and the expected interest rate. That's the rate of return on. So your asset that you hold as capital here, and you're forecasting the rate of return you're going to get next period on capital. Under Euler equation learning, which I'm about to move away from, but I want to compare them here. Under Euler equation learning, which is a special case of shadow price learning, you simply forecast the interest rate next period, you forecast your own consumption next period, and you choose your consumption now. And then the other equations are just the usual: wage is equal to marginal product of labor, rental rate, marginal product of capital, allowing for depreciation. There's a asset evolution equation, KT+1 equation there. Then you need forecasting equations, and since this is a non-stochastic model, let me keep it as simple as possible. We'll just have forecasts of interest rates, or the rental rate, and consumption using a really simple adaptive learning rule. It's a non-stochastic problem in which you update your forecast in the direction of the most recent observation by a constant gain gamma. So under Euler equation learning, I've now completely described it in this model for a very simple non-stochastic setup. Okay, it'll converge to the steady state. So the system will converge to the perfect foresight steady state asymptotically. How would infinite horizon learning work? You set up the so here the key thing is that you use the intertemporal budget constraint. So the intertemporal budget constraint will basically tell you that the present value of consumption has got to equal the present value of your wages plus your current assets, and you have to net out taxes. Take the Euler equation, substitute that into the intertemporal budget constraint, and you get the consumption function. So there's the consumption function right there. CT depends on expected future wages, expected future taxes, but we're going to assume those are equal to G per period, and also current wages and taxes, current assets, and then everything, the discount factor here, DE, depends on your expected future interest rates. So it's a very nice, traditional, clean consumption function, and that seems like a very reasonable way to approach things. And this is the kind of thing that has been exploited by Bruce Preston in a number of papers. Again, we can complete this with a learning rule. You have to have a learning rule of some sort for the forecast, and in this particular setting, we could just make it, because it's a non-stochastic setting, we can just use a very simple forecasting rule, which is, again, just updating your forecast of all future interest rates and wages based on your last period's forecast and the last period's observations. Obviously, you could do something more subtle. The big advantage of infinite horizon learning, from my point of view, is that it allows you to incorporate structural information, which is the other kind of point I wanted to make this morning. So in particular, it allows you to include information about future policy. So I'll give you a number of illustrations of that. But you can see that that can't be done in the Euler equation learning setup or the shadow price learning setup, which implicitly assumes a stationary environment. The infinite horizon approach allows you to get around a stationary environment. There may be other ways to do that, but this is a very natural way to do it. In their papers, Giuseppe and Preston have emphasized this from another angle, which is that you can incorporate structural information about policy rules. You can tell the agents, say, what the interest rate rule is going to be, and then when they're forecasting inflation and interest rates and the other things that they need to forecast, you can give them that extra structural information about the link between interest rates and inflation and output, the Taylor rule, or whatever, you know. And they make the point that if you give agents knowledge of the policy rule and they incorporate that in their infinite horizon decision making, that might facilitate stability under learning. And that was one of the points I said that learning gives you, adapting learning gives you, is the possibility that you design policy to facilitate coordination on the rational expectations equilibrium, or on something that's close to the rational expectations equilibrium. Okay, so I'll give you a different illustration, and this is work with Kaushik Mitra and Seppo Honkapoya. So in a paper in JME in 2009, we did the following. We said, let's take the Ramsey model, the non-stochastic Ramsey model that I've just described. Actually, we consider other models too, but this is one of the examples. Let's have a balanced budget, no debt, and let's suppose that the government announces at some point in time that in the future, government spending is going to increase or decrease and stay constant forever. So this is one of these classic exercises from rational expectations. You know, if you're teaching macroeconomics, it's quite likely that at some point you do experiments like this. You say, well, suppose the government announces now that 20 periods from now, there's going to be a permanent increase in government spending, and you can, lots of wrinkles on this, make good exam questions. And, what happens? What happens? And one of the things that happens is something happens right away, and then you follow a complicated path, and then you get to, okay. So, so the advantage of infinite horizon learning, you can do this under an adaptive learning setup. You separate the variables into those that you have structural information about, in this case, government spending path, which is the same here with balanced budget as a tax path, and the variables you don't have structural information about, wages, interest rates for the future. You use adaptive learning rules to forecast the wages and the interest rates, and then you combine that with your structural information, if you believe the government's announcement, which is the simplest version of this, but you can modify it, of course, then what happens? So here's what we found for the Ramsey model, and that was that, so here's the dash, so this is an announced announced future permanent increase in government spending. Under rational expectations, there's a drop, immediate drop in consumption, and at the dashed line, and then this is the path of consumption over time under the very simple learning rule I've described. As I said, it's a non-stochastic model. So there's an immediate hit to consumption, and then there's a gradual decline of consumption. And under learning, the learning rule I've described, this is a numerical result, there's, again, an immediate drop in consumption. In fact, the drop in consumption, it's a little bit too much. So because of the fact that they don't have rational expectations, they're having to use adaptive learning rules to forecast future wages and interest rates. They don't get that right, but they do know about that tax hit that's coming very soon. So they reduce consumption right away, in fact, a little bit too much. They overshoot a bit. There's a cyclical convergence path, or not cyclical, but non-monotonic anyway. And eventually, of course, they get to the new steady state as well, because it's stable under learning. So that's an example of how you can do this. Here's another example of how infinite horizon learning and structural information together can give you something interesting. When we were writing this paper, we got very worried about the Ricardian equivalence question. And I know Stefano and Bruce Preston have worried about the same thing. This is what we eventually decided on. When you think about Ricardian equivalence, you may wonder how important is rational expectations. Certainly, I've wondered that in the past, and we decided we could actually approach this question in a simple, systematic way. And one possible reaction is that it's absolutely vital. You think through the usual Ricardian equivalence arguments. There are like 3 or 4 ways you can argue it, and I think usually it seems like there's a lot of appeal to rationality. You're also appealing to other things, but so you might think rationality is crucial. Or so you might conclude that no Ricardian equivalence of no rational expectations. Or you might decide, well, learning tends to converge. Maybe it's approximately rational if the learning rule is approximately rational. Then you have approximate Ricardian equivalence. Or you might decide, no, it's the agents incorporating the intertemporal budget constraint of the government, and so you're always going to have Ricardian equivalence. Doesn't matter whether you're rational or not. So we decided the result was as follows. If neither government spending nor expectations, so this is for perfectly general learning rules, okay? This is adaptive learning. We set it up in a general way. It applies to least squares learning, but it can be any kind of learning that's adaptive, that responds to the data. So assume that neither government spending nor expectations depends on government financing variables. In other words, the debt and taxes. Then the Ramsey model will exhibit Ricardian equivalence. On the other hand, if say, expectations in the learning rule, whatever it is, depend on financing variables, then you won't have Ricardian equivalence. So that's something which was not obvious to us beforehand, and ex post is totally obvious. But so anyway. And then I have some examples here of from the paper. The top line shows the rational expectations path and the learning path. They're both very different, but this is a case in which the learning is set up so the Ricardian equivalence holds. It doesn't matter how you finance things, you get the same learning path, even though expectations don't look very rational. And the bottom panel, I don't want to spend any more time on this, but the bottom panel illustrates the fact that under learning, you can get very different results if the learning rule depends on government debt. Okay, here's another, well, let me take an example from Stefano and Bruce Preston. I'll be very quick on this so I can make my final points, but Stefano and Bruce Preston looked in their AER paper at a different question, which was business cycle fluctuations in the RBC model. They basically take a pretty standard RBC model and make the main modification, which is that agents are learning rather than have rational expectations. And what difference does that make? And people have looked at it in the past using Euler equation learning and decided not too much. Even with constant gain, there doesn't seem to be a lot in it. But what they found was that it made a lot of difference if you use infinite horizon learning. So it's basically there's the production function up there. They have a unit root in the technological progress. Otherwise, pretty standard, or that's one standard way to do it. Representative household maximizes utility in the usual way. They detrend in the usual way when you have a random walk with drift for technology. They log linearize. They substitute into the intertemporal budget constraint that's been log linearized. I'm omitting a few steps. They have a long appendix. You aggregate. You get a consumption function. There's a consumption function again. It's just basically Euler equation inside intertemporal budget constraint. And so consumption depends on things that are like present values of future stuff. Okay, so, and then this is a stochastic model now, so you do the usual things for least squares learning. They've got to forecast rental rates, they have to forecast wages, and they do so using also a forecast of the law of motion of capital, and you do this and you estimate using constant gain, with a small constant gain. And you let the thing run and see what happens. And then they look at the results. And their findings are that for their calibrated model, so they put a lot of effort into this, they find that the learning model delivers the same output volatility with smaller technology shocks. I think that came up in Mordecai's talk, actually. Somebody yesterday was pointing out that technology shocks that seem to be assumed in the RBC model look sometimes implausibly high. Well, this helps on this. You also get more volatility in investment in hours, and you get some more persistence in investment in hours. So their basic conclusion is that adding infinite horizon learning with constant gain helps fit the model to the data. And the basic mechanism is that you occasionally get these partially self-fulfilling shifts, optimistic waves or pessimistic waves of expectations that results from technology shifts, technology shocks driving the coefficients away from the RE values for a while before they tend to return. Okay, two more examples, but one I will just mention and leave this to Kaushik. So Kaushik Mitra and Seppo Honkapoy and I have looked at policy change and learning in the RBC model, and we have some further results beyond the Ramsey one, and Kaushik will talk about that tomorrow, I guess. Yeah. Okay, so one more example. This is work with Jess Ben-Habib and Seppo Honkapoy on liquidity traps and expectation dynamics. So this is a new Keynesian type model. We use the Rodenberg model, the Rodenberg version of the pricing friction rather than Calvo, because then you can keep all of the nonlinearities of the original system. So you can do a global analysis under adaptive learning. And in previous work, Seppo and I with Aaron Guzzi have looked at Euler equation learning in this setup. and found the possibility of deflation traps. And so we find, in the work with Jess, we found that there is, under infinite horizon learning, set up in a particular way, that tractable way, that there is the same result. So this is just a nice illustration, I think, of the learning dynamics. The key variables in the New Keynesian model are inflation and output. This is a phase diagram that actually captures the e-stability dynamics that drives the real-term learning dynamics, with inflation expectations on the horizontal axis and output expectations on the vertical axis. The targeted steady state, so 1.02 on the horizontal axis, corresponds to an inflation target of 2%, and the vertical axis, so that you see some lines that cross there, that's the targeted steady state. The arrows give you the direction in which expectations are driven if they're initially away from the rational expectations value. And you can see that the targeted steady state is locally stable under learning. It's expectationally stable. There tends to be cyclical dynamics around it, but anyway, we actually set this up in a non-stochastic setting because we have this global structure to keep things simple, although you could introduce stochastic shocks and least squares learning, but we use fairly simple learning rules. So it's locally stable, but you'll also see it's not globally stable. So there's this corridor of stability, and anywhere inside that corridor of stability, learning dynamics will push you eventually to the targeted steady state that policymakers are aiming at. But if there's some sharp expectational shock, say, suppose there's a financial crisis or some crazy thing, and people's expectations of output and inflation drop enough, that puts you to the southwest of the, or well, anywhere outside the corridor of stability, but it might push you in particular to the southwest, and then the trajectories diverge. So actually, in this paper, we consider versions both with and without Ricardian equivalence, which adds, there's some extra interest there. There's a possibility without Ricardian equivalence of certain Pagou type effects returning you. But anyway, we look at this setup both with in the Ricardian case and the non-Ricardian case. This illustrates the Ricardian case. The non-Ricardian case, you can't reduce things to 2 dimensions, so I can't show you anything particularly convenient. But anyway, the other question that we look at in this paper, the title of which is Liquidity Traps and Expectation Dynamics, Fiscal Stimulus or Fiscal Austerity. There are cases where either could work, but the policy that we find most reliable includes, well, we consider a variety of policies, but one possibility, if you find yourself to the southwest there in the divergent region, is to use a temporary fiscal stimulus that's been very carefully tuned. So that's not actually our preferred one, but this will work. If you have a temporary increase in government spending, financed by taxes, of the right length and the right size, then that will drive you out. So you can't see the initial point, which is down. This is a real-time learning simulation. The initial point has low output and low inflation before the stimulus. But anyway, it eventually drives you back to the targeted steady state. It gets you into, eventually, the corridor of stability. Anyway. Okay, so I've got about 5 minutes left. 5 to 10 minutes left. 5 minutes left. Where's my time? My
7 minutes.
7 minutes. He's such an authoritarian. Okay, just right. So let me go back to methodology. And now I just want to say a few words about adductive stability. Roger is going to talk about adductive stability. Remember I said there's this kind of branch. Do you go adductive or adaptive? Adductive stability models agents as theorists, and the basic idea is you suppose agents are hyper-rational, they know the entire economic structure, that's common knowledge, you know, the rationality is common knowledge, and so on. And the question is, can you deduce the rational expectations equilibrium? And Florian gave an example of that from the cobweb model yesterday. If the rational expectations equilibrium can be deduced, we say it's eductively stable. So the first point is not all rational expectations equilibria are eductively stable. Common knowledge of the structure and rationality may not be sufficient for coordination of expectations. And an example is the cobweb model with that alpha, that feedback parameter, less than -1. And in work with Bruce McGew, Bruce, Roger, and me, we've shown that the RBC model is not eductively stable in a strong sense. So it fails to be strongly eductively stable. So I'm not going to go into that, but my basic point is that the failure of eductive stability opens the door for adaptive learning. You know, if you decide that rational agents, even if they have all the knowledge of the structure and they're all rational and they know that everybody else knows the structure, they know that everybody's rational, if they can't work out the rational expectations equilibrium, then what do? Well, they have to fall back on adaptive learning of some sort. It opens the door for a variety of types of adaptive learning. It may be ones in which they do standard least squares learning, or it may be these dynamics predictor selection things, or, you know, that we've seen the whole range. We've begun to see a huge range. Everything that we've seen yesterday, in a sense, the door is open for that. Also, of course, we may not know the full structure. So agents may have incomplete knowledge of the economic structure. They may have very little knowledge of the economic structure. Or they may distrust the rationality of other agents. Or they may not be fully rational themselves. So all of these things also open the door on adaptive learning. So, so I don't regard these as like antithetical approaches. They're complementary approaches. That's what I'm trying to say. Let me review the relative advantage of shadow price learning and infinite horizon learning, and then I have a few final comments along those lines. So both shadow price learning and infinite horizon learning implement adaptive learning in models with long-lived agents. They both can converge to rational expectations. They both have advantages and disadvantages. So shadow price learning only requires agents to make one-period forecasts and solve relatively simple two-period optimization problems, and it's computationally relatively simple. That's obviously an advantage. Against that, shadow price learning assumes a stationary environment, and there's no way to incorporate, in a simple way anyway, knowledge about future structural change. And it does not explicitly give you, and it doesn't explicitly use the intertemporal budget constraint or even explicitly impose the transversality condition. Even though those things are satisfied asymptotically in the setup that we give. Infinite horizon learning, agents make optimal decision forecasts, conditional on forecasts of future state variables, or variables outside the agent's control, and explicitly imposes these intertemporal budget constraints and transversality condition. So the great selling point of it, from my point of view, is that plus, the explicit form is nice, plus known future policy changes can be incorporated. On the other hand, infinite horizon learning neglects the additional parameter uncertainty in long horizon forecasts and assumes that agents can solve pretty difficult optimization problems, and is computationally more demanding for the agents. So, I'm really, I like both approaches. And I think it depends on the setting, which is more appealing. I should also say a couple of words about Bayesian learning, because that deals with some of these issues, but not all. So in the Muth-Lucas model and the Kagan model, Bayesian learning doesn't add a lot. It was actually already there in Bray and Sabin. They gave agents priors, and their least squares learning was actually updating the priors to posteriors and continuing going. It didn't make a huge lot of difference. It made no difference asymptotically, and it didn't make a lot of difference en route. It's a relatively minor modification of least squares learning. And in particular, it's not adding priors the way Bray and Sabin did not make it more rational. It just made the agents add a prior. The prior, it didn't make it more rational because the subjective probability distribution used by the agents in Bayesian learning was not the correct probability distribution, which is a very complicated object, which no one has been able to, well, and I can't say no one. It would require coordination itself in order for agents to have the right prior. So it doesn't solve the coordination problem. You can incorporate Bayesian learning in models with long-lived agents and short planning horizons. So we could add that into shadow price learning, obviously. And Adam and Marcet do this in a short horizon version of a infinite horizon, a long-lived agent model in one of their papers in JET recently. In models with longer planning horizons, you could have agents doing Bayesian learning, and the advantage is that that would allow agents with longer planning horizons incorporate the fact that their parameter estimates are going to change over time, that they know that and they take account of that in a systematic way. Tim Cogley and Tom Sargent did this in an IER paper in 2008, but to make it tractable, they assumed finite lives. They weren't infinitely lived. They lived for a finite number of periods, and their exogenous variables was a two-state stationary Markov process, and that made the problem feasible. So, but they also found, I might add, that the optimization using their Bayesian learning, taking account of parameter uncertainty, was really approximated by by optimization using least squares learning. So it didn't turn out to be a big deal in that setting. Last comment along these lines, the planning horizon, what about finite horizon learning? So this tension between short and long horizons isn't new, by the way. Timmerman on asset pricing had some papers on this. Well, his 1996 R.E. Stud paper actually did learning both ways, present value approach and a one-step ahead approach, which he called them present value and self-referential learning. And there have been other papers that have compared these two approaches. But anyway, given this tension here, is there some resolution to this tension? Well, as Bill Branch and Bruce Begue and I say in another paper, introspection and common sense suggest finite horizon learning. Why can't we have something in between that's maybe adapted to whatever problem we have at hand? So you can generalize both Euler equation learning or shadow price learning to a finite horizon setting, or you can generalize infinite horizon learning to a finite horizon setting. And they're different. But you can have n-step versions of each. That's the point. And in that paper, we noticed that the planning horizon can affect things like speed of convergence and other features. But I think, if you take the cognitive consistency view and think about yourself, do you look 1 year ahead or throughout the rest of your life? I think sometimes I think about 5 years ahead. So I don't know about you. Okay, so the conclusions, adaptive learning approach, you treat agents as econometricians. Cognitive consistency principle suggests that if structural knowledge is imperfect, or if common knowledge of rationality is unlikely or too much, or if adductive stability fails, you're going to need adaptive learning. In decision making, sometimes long horizon models are good, sometimes short horizon models look good, maybe something in between would look good. Well, I've said everything.
Okay, thank you, Joe.
Thanks.